Jesus' passion, arrested, sentenced to death, crucified, is retold through readings in Christian services during Holy Week. Tragically, over the centuries, these retellings have pitted Christians against Jews and have even led to murderous violence. Such sinful consequences are contrary to the good news of Christ. In this video series, members of the Christian Scholars Group on Christian-Jewish Relations, along with two expert Jewish colleagues, explore 4 scenes in the Passion story. Basing their discussions on decades of research, they consider how Jesus' passion can be presented in fresh ways that repudiate anti-Jewish biases and underscore the gospel message. This task is a sacred obligation. In this segment, we explore the image of the Jewish conspiracy against Jesus.
The 4 anti-Jewish images of the Passion in this series are Judas, the conspiracy of Jewish leaders against Jesus, the crowd that cries out to Pilate for his death, and the crucifixion itself. Today, I'm here with Peter Pettit, Professor Emeritus of Religion Studies at Muhlenberg College, and now teaching pastor at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. I am Katharina von Kellenbach, Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland and Project Coordinator at the Evangelische Akademie in Berlin. We will be talking about the Jewish conspiracy.
Indeed. Thank you, Katharina. All of the gospel writers show a conspiracy developing during Jesus' public life, sometimes in response to his healing, sometimes to his teaching. And all of them tell of a decision among temple leaders and some Pharisees to find a secretive way to arrest and kill Jesus around the Passover festival in Jerusalem. To take one example from Mark's Gospel, at the beginning of chapters 14 and 15, we read first, "It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. And then, as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate."
That idea of a Jewish conspiracy against Jesus has been part of the Christian tradition for a very long time. This is a Dutch woodcut from 400 years ago, where a solitary Jesus faces more than a dozen members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. In the 19th century in France, James Tissot painted dozens of pictures portraying the life of Jesus. These 3 show the progression from the Jewish conspiracy to the chief priests take counsel together, and then the morning judgment. Notice how this is always a group with their heads leaning in toward one another. And in the last picture, how high the council sits above Jesus, who is bound and surrounded.
Even more recently, we've seen similar depictions. In Oberammergau, Germany, the biggest and longest running Passion play, as recently as 1980, was described this way. In scene after scene, the Jewish establishment conspired, with or without the merchants and Judas, to finish off this enemy of Moses and Israel. The goal of the conspirators had always been death. The chants, muss sterben, he must die, and ans Kreuz mit ihm, to the cross with him. These are repeated so many times that even a small child can understand the perfidy of the Jews. Pictures of the Passion play show the temple priests plotting against Jesus even before they meet him or bring him in for questioning.
There's another graphic example of that scene in the 1973 film Jesus Christ Superstar, entitled This Jesus Must Die. As Jesus arrives in Jerusalem with some followers, the director, Norman Jewison, has the priests dressed in all black robes, standing on a scaffolding like vultures high above Jesus and his little group. They are casual in light colors and dance along in the roadway below. And the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, the contrast deepens. The crowd's happy Hosanna are set against the deep, foreboding bass voice of the high priest Caiaphas. And as in Ober Ammergau, the judgment is in before the encounter starts. This Jesus must die.
That's just remarkable, isn't it? Why are the Jewish priests depicted as such dangerous, powerful conspirators?
We will look at the history to see why, but we also have to look at the historical record of the damage that has been done by this myth of the Jewish conspiracy.
Real damage? Real harm?
Absolutely. For instance, during the Black Plague in 1348, the Christian communities across Europe believed that the Jews conspired to poison the wells in order to make their Christian neighbors sick. This idea that Jews are powerful and operate in hidden ways to control the affairs of state and church in order to harm innocent Christians has fueled anti-Jewish violence. Good Friday became so dangerous for Jews in Europe that some bishops cautioned the Jews to stay inside on that day, lest Christians who had listened to the story of the Jews who plotted to entrap and kill Jesus take revenge. This caution may have saved some individual Jews, but it didn't stop the violence and contempt for Jews.
And isn't it also true that whole Jewish communities were forced out of their countries in retaliation for alleged plots against church and state?
Yes, between 1290 and 1492, virtually every country in Western Europe expelled their Jews. They were blamed for high taxes and for state debt, for inciting war and for causing drought and famine. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Secret Service forged a document that they called the Secret Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which accuses a group of Jews to seek control of the world's economy, their governments, and the entire society.
Yeah, and this isn't just ancient history. This book has been translated into many languages and distributed around the world. Here in the United States, for example, in the early 20th century, it was endorsed and funded by Henry Ford. And now, in addition to many other languages, it's been translated into Arabic, Turkish, Farsi.
Here's a cartoon from over 80 years ago. But this image keeps reappearing, no matter how often the protocols have been debunked by scholars over and over again. Today, the conspiracy reappears in the worldwide QAnon conspiracy. But even on small church websites, such as this one, their commentary on the Russian invasion of Ukraine reuses the image of the Rothschilds. Here, the Rothschild family is blamed for controlling all banks, the media, oil, and all governments. And of course, they're somehow responsible for this war that is going on.
That same poster was also posted to social media by a professor at Oberlin College just a few years ago in the 2015, 2016. The Jewish conspiracy is probably the only topic that conservative and progressive Christians, as well as secular and Muslim activists, can agree on. Why is it so persuasive?
We believe that the Passion story has at least contributed to planting the seed, that there is a Jewish elite that meets in secret in order to hunt down an innocent man for dubious reasons. Because after all, Jesus preaches in public, but the Jews act in secret, and they don't have good intentions or any rational reasons, but act out of pure malice.
But is this true? How should we understand the temple priests and the opponents of Jesus? Why was Jesus arrested and handed over?
There's both a historical story that we need to take note of, and there are theological reasons, and we need to look at both.
Well, the historical story starts with the fact that temple priests in Jerusalem served at the pleasure of the Roman governor. At the time, Judea is a Roman province, and Pontius Pilate is absolutely in charge. The temple collected taxes for the Romans, and they were responsible to tell Pilate about any potential troublemakers in order to keep the peace.
And does this make them conspirators? Or should we blame the crucifixion on the occupation and on the Roman Empire? That is, after all, what our creed says. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
But Pilate is shown to wash his hands in innocence. Why do the texts emphasize Roman innocence and Jewish guilt? Why did the Christian tradition emphasize the Jewish conspiracy and turn Pilate into a saint? Why?
There's another historical reason for that, and that is that the early Jesus communities feared persecution by Roman authorities, especially after the Roman-Jewish War and the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, just a few decades after Jesus' death. For these early Christians, it was very dangerous to confess allegiance to a Messiah who was crucified by a Roman governor.
The Gospels were written in the late first century and 2 generations after Jesus' death. And by then, the temple and the high priesthood had been destroyed by the Romans. Although Rome had crushed the political revolt of the Judeans, it still respected the religion of biblical Israel. And followers of Jesus wanted to claim that heritage of biblical Israel and thereby stay in Rome's good graces. So they would not do well to emphasize that a Roman governor killed their Messiah. It would be easier to explain that Jesus' death was engineered by Jewish leaders, leaders who in their own day also stood behind rival groups who also wanted Rome to recognize them.
And it wasn't just easier, it was actually a matter of life and death. And this helps explain why the 4 Gospels shift the blame from Pontius Pilate and the Roman authorities to the Jewish leaders and the Jewish religion.
So why was he arrested?
Especially around Passover, the Roman army was always on high alert in Jerusalem because thousands of Jews went on pilgrimage to celebrate and commemorate the Exodus and miraculous salvation of the Hebrew slaves from captivity in Egypt. It was a freedom festival. If I were a Roman governor, I would arrest anybody who preached about the imminent arrival of the kingdom of heaven, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and then Jesus enters the temple and attacks the traders and the money changers who are part of that taxation system. It makes sense that the authorities would be nervous about this preacher from Galilee and his disciples.
Yes, nervous is a good word, and that does not yet qualify as a conspiracy. It did not need a conspiracy to deal with that situation. Actually, in the newer stagings of the Oberammergau Passion Play, this history is much, much clearer. Pilate is shown clearly in charge, and Caiaphas does his bidding.
That sounds like a good step forward on the history side, but of course, the crucifixion is so much more than the historical facts of Jesus' arrest, trial, execution for a political charge of revolution as the king of the Jews. There are also theological reasons why the Jewish priests were shown as conspirators and blamed for the death of Jesus.
When the Gospels portray the Jews as guilty of killing the Son of God, the Jews lose their status as chosen people. They slip into the role of evil stewards who must be rejected and are eventually replaced by the Gentiles. The church now becomes the new Israel. And there's a second theological reason for the power of this conspiracy myth. And that is the Christian confession that Jesus died for our sins, because that means that we are responsible for his death and not the Jewish priests.
Right. Well, that's already clear in the earliest New Testament writings from Paul. In fact, Paul hardly says anything about how Jesus died or who was involved. He emphasizes instead that Jesus died so that we would be freed from the power of sin and death.
And that is hard to swallow. What? I'm somehow responsible for Jesus' death?
Well, there is a hymn that says that pretty clearly. Ah, Holy Jesus is all about that. The second verse ends with that powerful line, I it was denied thee, I crucified thee.
And the Passion narrative is really a story about all kinds of human failings. There's abandonment, there are false witnesses, there's humiliation, mockery, betrayal, indifference, denial. And that is a pretty good catalog of human sinfulness.
Certainly is. Who hasn't done or experienced those things in larger and smaller ways at one time or another? And this is what our tradition teaches. This is what killed Jesus and is killing him over and over again. Not a Jewish conspiracy.
But it's also easy to understand how much simpler it is to blame a bunch of ancient Jews than to confront my own sins. And even doing that becomes one more sin, doesn't it?
Yes. And it's painfully ironic because Paul teaches that Jesus' death took away punishment. And yet we've seen how down through the centuries, Christianity has long insisted that the Jews must be punished.
And that's the idea of replacement and supersession. Because they killed Jesus, the church is now God's chosen people. And that is the exact opposite of what Paul is teaching about the meaning of the death of Jesus.
So as long as we blame the Jews and suspect a Jewish conspiracy, we miss the real depth of the story of the crucifixion and the ways in which Jesus' death redeems the messiness of human life with all of its psychological and cultural, biological, political, historical complications and complexities.
And in that very respect, blaming the Jewish conspiracy constitutes a sin because it profoundly misunderstands and misreads the meaning of Jesus' death. Jesus did not die because some Jews plotted to arrest him. Jesus died to reveal some good news. So this isn't just about correcting an error, but it is about understanding our own gospel message better.
We need to look for the whole story of God in Scripture in order to understand why Jesus was born a Jew, why he lived as a Jew, and why he died as a Jew. What does this Jewishness mean for Christians today? How does this connect the global church to Israel, the Israel of the Bible, the Jews in history, and the Jews today? Is this a connection that goes deeper than the connectedness that we share with all of humankind because every one of us is created in the image of God?
We believe that we really must begin to tell the story of Jesus' crucifixion without this Jewish conspiracy and without the false idea about the rejection and punishment of the Jews. And that if we read the Gospels historically and theologically correctly, we will end up with a story that connects the church and Israel in a covenantal path that we walk separately, but also together.
The key thing then becomes that Jesus' death and resurrection reveals the infinite value of human life, and it invites us into a partnership to live into that dignity and commitment as much as possible.
The point of the Passion story is not to blame the Jews, but to call us into responsibility and toward the fullness of life.
And that raises a number of questions for us, which we invite people to consider as they continue this conversation. Thank you, Katerina.
Thank you, Peter.